Yeah. That's mine, yeah. I put together a little packet, which I would like to go through very, very quickly here, seeing that we're dealing with the issue of co-op school districts and everything associated with assets, apportionment of board members, all that. I think it's important that we take a little walk through so everybody has a pretty good understanding of what we're addressing here. This is not an issue unique to this particular year. I've been in the education committee for the last 14 years, and I can't remember a year in which we didn't discuss co-ops. It's one of those topics that just is very difficult because it entails talking about every aspect of the state in terms of our demographic, our population, and our organizational structure. So if you have a copy of this, I'd like to wade through it first. For folks, the way this thing came out, I'll just take the order of the sheets that are there. A co-op district is one which has various school districts within it that are part of that cooperative agreement. And it's an agreement which you write amongst those people that are coming together, districts coming together, and it's like a marriage. And if anybody's been through a divorce, fortunately, I've never had that not opportunity, that decision to make, but it's difficult, and it carries with it so many issues and so many strings. So the first one shows you that in terms of the Randolph, Gorham, Shelburne Co-op District, and then it goes Merrimack Valley, Timberlane, and Conocook. It shows the census when it was done, the population as of that 2020, and the percentage of the population that comes from each particular community, and the seats, whether they be a seat at large or a seat that's unique, just uniquely to that particular district. There are a number of co-op districts. If you go to sheet 2 there, apportionment formulas for cooperative school districts. For your information, we have it's 30 plus co-op districts in the state. And if you look at the number of towns or school districts that involves, it involves close to 120 districts within this state. That's a high number of the districts. And so what we're talking about issues here in these 3 bills which impact from north to south and east to west in the state of New Hampshire. So you can go through and see all those particular districts. I, for one, live in a district which is a co-op district. And within that district, there's 7 at-large members, of which they all come from the same community. It's because we had one village district that initially had their own school. It's since closed down, and Woodsville is now part of Haverhill. So it's a Haverhill co-op with just 7 at-large members. They're all at-large because one area town never put anybody on the docket to be voted for, so they all were coming initially from North Haverhill and Woodsville. Haverhill Corner didn't care. So looking at the way they get together, there's articles of agreement, and you can see on the down in the next below in the packet there shows all the co-ops. There's an article of agreement, and we just took that one district as the first pile. Last year and years before, we've looked at this issue, even when we had Representative Grenier in charge of a commission to look at this. We gathered many, many articles of agreement together. This was just the first one on the top of the heap. I took it and ran it off today, so you can see that there are articles which tells you how members are apportioned to those districts and how often the agreements are looked at to review or update, be it 10 years or 5 years. And there's a lot to it. Usually you'll see 7, 9, 11, 13, 15, up to 15 members that can be on a co-op board. Going through this further here, and we've had some samples there of how seats might be proportioned if you do the one man, one vote type principle. And lastly, there is a sheet there which shows we struggled with apportionment last year, and we did come up with an amendment which did not fly. The bill was I think it was the Litchfield bill, and that bill is not one we're discussing today. That's one that did have a lot more energy given to it by the whole folks here, because we were looking at one person, one vote, and the smaller districts sometimes are the ones which don't have that. They have to combine with another one. So with that, that's information available to you. I'd like to now just open this up to where we have to be today. The purpose of the interim study is to recommend that we either move forward with these bills, with legislation in the upcoming session, not necessarily these bills per se, but language which addresses some of the what you see in the analysis of those bills. Go forward with it, make recommendations, go forward perhaps with recommendations, or if we make the decision, we're not going to move the bill forward, we're not going to move that concept forward, we're going to leave it alone. So those are the only two options which we really have on the interim study. We're not here to design new legislation. We can, that's done individually or by the group later on when we put in and put legislation in. We've already gone through one filing period, which opened up on September 6th and closed on September 16th. For those that are in the House right now, there will be another filing period after the election. And that it will be when you'll see anything, if anything does come forward regarding this. So with that, I'd like to open this up. And is there any further discussion right now on these bills? We have 1366, 1399, and 1679. 1366 is relative to school board reapportionment. 1399 is relative to school district withdrawal from a school district. There's a lot of energy been put on that. And 1679 came from my friend to my right, your left, Representative Cordelli. And we've gone through this for a number of years. And his concept was, let's just dissolve it all and start all over again. That was, so that's relative to the dissolution and repeal of the cooperative school districts. We've gone through consolidation of schools over in the state of Maine, and as I recall, when I was an administrator over there, we ended up consolidating one school district, Rumford, Mexico, and they were going to do that anyways, seeing they're right on the Androscoggin River there, and they really are one community. Vermont's also gone through an act over there, of which, from my talking with, as superintendent was over there, who's now came back and left that state to be back in New Hampshire here, who's now since retired, he indicated to me that the administrative costs for their act are higher now than they were before. So consolidation has some financial issues associated with it. So with that, we're open, the committee's open now to discussion on any of the three bills or on the issue of cooperative schools. Representative Mullen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you remind me whether or not these bills came from requests by cooperative school districts to change the membership or change the affiliation?
The first two bills that we had in order of numbering basically were a result of a district feeling that they didn't have the representative of that district was voted upon at large, and I'm just trying to recall in my memory too that the person was not domiciled in that particular community and elected by the people in that particular district. They were elected at large. So the districts with a greater population were deciding members on the board, on the co-op board. I believe that. I may be wrong, Representative Cordelli. Is that your?
I believe that's generally the case.
Yeah, and they were presented by one representative. Representative Power was the one that.
Right, and just as a follow-up comment, I was asking because I know the Representative Power is from Merrimack. Which district is she from? Merrimack? Is it Merrimack? Oh, Hollis Brookline. All right, so she is from a cooperative district. Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. further discussion on this? Okay, I'll open this up to the public too. If there is an individual here or a group that would like to speak in regard to a concern dealing with the cooperative school districts, or to offer us some input and how to make a decision here, we'd welcome that at this time. Okay, our New Hampshire School Boards Association. Welcome, Barrett.
Good morning, thank you, Chairman Ladd.
Do you have your mic on?
There you go. Good morning, thank you, Chairman Ladd. Good morning, members of the committee. Barrett Christina from the New Hampshire School Boards Association. I bet you're all surprised to see me here when we're talking about these bills. Just to once again reiterate, as I mentioned a handful of times last year, NHSBA's position would be that the legislature adopt a 2-year-long study commission so we can do this properly. We can bring in the DRA, we can bring in the Secretary of State's office or AG to talk about the one man, one vote. We can bring in school board members from cooperative school districts, superintendents from cooperative school districts, and do a very comprehensive review of RSA 195 in its totality. These sort of patchwork approaches, in my opinion and NHSBA's opinion, do not fit for the complexities of the 32 co-ops in the state. So that would be NHSBA's recommendation.
Thank you, Barrett. Barrett, would you give maybe the committee a brief overview? For example, if I'm a district and I want out,
Yep.
About the feasibility study, the sustainability of it, and then how the state board interacts with the local board.
Sure, I can talk about that a little bit. I do know that we do have an attorney in the audience who has worked with school districts going through withdrawal processes, so he probably has better specific information and knowledge than I would. But essentially, a warrant article can be placed on a school district warrant to study withdrawal or to study the makeup of your apportionment formula or to review your articles of agreement. You can do that at any time. There is another odd twist in the co-op statute where on the town warrant at the town annual meeting, that one of the towns that is part of the co-op can have on the town warrant a petition warrant article to study withdrawal. If that passes, then the school board of the co-op district is obligated to initiate a withdrawal study. The statutes relative to dissolution of property are confusing, and I don't have the best handle on those, to be quite honest with you. I was in our office yesterday with our staff attorney trying to assist one community that is in the middle of a withdrawal process, and we read this statute 6 different ways and came up with a different conclusion 6 different times. So but essentially, there's a study committee made up of a couple people from each of the towns. I believe the superintendent is an ex officio member of that committee, and I think you can add people to the committee. Sometimes I've seen select board members or various constituents from either of the communities, and they run through the numbers. They talk about how much it would cost. They talk about if there's any outstanding indebtedness, if there's, for example, a bond on a building, and what person may have to or what community may have to sort of pay back a portion of that bond. There's discussions about this not just real property, but personal property, desks and computers, and what's going to happen with the teachers and things of that nature. So the committee then comes up with a withdrawal plan. They make a recommendation to either yes, pursue withdrawal or not pursue withdrawal. At that point, the plan, if you will, or the findings go to the state board. There is a provision in the law that allows for a minority report to go to the state board. We added that in the law about 5 years ago. So it's a lot more complex than that, but I also don't want to sit here for an hour explaining every nuance of RSA 195 and the withdrawal statutes.
So if the state board accepts the withdrawal plan or denies that, what's the next step?
It goes back to the vote. It goes back to the voters. One of the interesting things is, and I have to double check, I believe the vote to withdraw is co-op wide, though. It's not just the community. It's not just the one town within the co-op that's looking to withdraw. And I guess the rationale for that was when the co-op was formed, it took a vote of all the communities to form the co-op. So I guess it takes takes two parties to get married, and in this case, I guess it takes two parties to get divorced too, and you can't just run off, and the town can't just file for divorce on its own. I know that was been an issue in some communities as well too. But essentially, the state board would either approve or disapprove the proposal, and then it goes back to the voters of the co-op wide, and they ultimately vote on whether or not that town can or should withdraw.
Thank you. That's my understanding too. Yes, Representative Luno.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Christina. In 195.18, which has, 195 has a number of sections in it. 18, I think, talks specifically about cooperative school districts, and it addresses what has to be in the articles of agreement, and one of the things it talks about is dissolution, but does it also, I guess, is withdrawal the same or different? Is it the same or different than dissolution? And have you does the statute provide any I guess standards for what needs to be considered in an article of withdrawal or an article for dissolution?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Representative. I believe withdrawal and dissolution are different things. Dissolution means that the co-op is no longer existing as a corporate legal entity. For example, a number of years ago, the Goshen-Lemster Cooperative School District dissolved. So you had two single districts, then you had Goshen and Lemster. There's no more cooperative. That's a dissolution. Alternatively, if you had a 3-town co-op and 1 town withdrew, the 2 remaining towns would not have dissolved. It would have been amended, if you will. So yes, there's a difference between a withdrawal and a dissolution. Dissolution, the co-op no longer exists as a legal entity. Withdrawal, you might have one community withdraw from a 4 or 5 town co-op. The remaining towns still exist as the co-op. And I forget what the second part of your question was, Representative. Something about
Right. So yeah, and I'll actually turn it into a follow-up if that's okay,
Go ahead.
Rick. So in the statute 195.18, where the state does require agreements to have
yep.
to have a provision for dissolution. Does the state also require provision in the Articles of Agreement for withdrawal? And then the question is, does the statute get into any details in terms of what is permitted in the Articles of Agreement,
Right.
in any of these different areas, or is it really left up to the co-op and the state?
Sure.
board?
One of the problems with the statute as currently written is that it oftentimes uses different words, but there seems to be an implication that they're intended to mean the same thing. So under RSA 195.18, procedure for formation of a cooperative school district, and this is down in subparagraph K. For cooperative school districts formed after the date of this subparagraph, which I believe is probably 1963, a plan for dissolution of the co-op. So you're forming documents. Your articles of agreement have to have a plan for dissolution, but there's nothing in there that talks about a plan upon withdrawal of one of the members. In terms of what has to go into the withdrawal plan, that is RSA 195:26. What's interesting about that, I was just talking about this with our statute or our staff attorney yesterday. There's a conflict between 195:26 and 195:28. I'm trying to find where that was. Is it capital? So, for example, so I'm in 195:28 if you have it in front of you. The second to last sentence. The amount of said capital improvements and additions at the time of the transfer title shall be determined by the agreement for withdrawal between the cooperative school district and the withdrawing school district. So agreement for withdrawal, there's no agreement for withdrawal. That's described as a withdrawal plan in the earlier statutes. But the other interesting aspect about that, where it says the amount of said capital improvements and additions and the time of transfer of title, if you go back up to 195.26, I don't think it doesn't necessarily talk about the capital improvements and additions. There's some language in there about outstanding indebtedness. So there's some conflict between 195.28 and 195.26 about what needs to be within the plan. I will say that the withdrawal plans are usually much more comprehensive than what 195.26 requires. That's my sort of anecdotal knowledge, if you will.
So do all articles of agreement have to include a withdrawal plan?
Not a withdrawal plan, but if we go back up to 195.18, the articles of agreement are supposed to include. So we paragraph 3 of 195.28 says the cooperative school district planning board may recommend that a cooperative school district composed of all the districts represented by its membership, so on and so forth. The planning board shall prepare proposed articles of agreement for the proposed cooperative school district, which shall be signed by a majority of the planning board, which shall set forth the following. And then it lists out paragraph A through L or K or whatever it is. And then K talks about the dissolution. So the articles of agreement have to have a provision about what happens upon dissolution of the co-op. But the articles of agreement, the formational documents, don't have to have anything in there about withdrawal of the agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Obviously, when co-ops have formed, there was some sense of consensus on need and common interest, et cetera. And over the years, those interests may change. Politics may change. Numbers may change. So when a dissolution or a withdrawal takes place, I want to focus on the withdrawal issue, and you have a new school district basically created as a result of the withdrawal. My question deals with the fiscal nature of this. That obviously when you have a co-op, there's a sharing of costs from the various various communities, et cetera. But when that withdrawal takes place, that community that withdraws bears the burden of the fiscal nature of running a school district. So my question has to deal with the increased cost that may come to a community, or a decrease in cost perhaps. What's been your experience as it relates to the impact on the citizens and the students in that withdrawal as it relates to the fiscal cost of the withdrawal?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question, Representative. I'll be quite honest with you. I don't know if I have any direct knowledge as to what sort of the resulting fiscal or educational impact has been on the town that has withdrawn. I'm trying to think of. I mean, there haven't been too many towns that have withdrawn from co-ops in the last 15 years. Maybe a couple statewide. Messinic kind of blew up a number of years ago. There have been efforts. I know there were some issues in Timberlane. There's an issue in Carroll going on right now. My experience, again, anecdotally, and just remember some of the people that we brought in with the study commission 5 or 6 years ago, whenever that was, Chairman Ladd. A lot of the complaints seem to do with sort of the apportionment formula. One town feeling that they were paying too much, or one town feeling that they were paying too much and not necessarily getting the services back for their kids and perhaps their little elementary school. So I don't have any direct experience as to the fiscal impact. I will say though, it's probably, if a community withdraws from a co-op and they simply turn around and tuition their kids back to the same high school that they were going, I don't know if that flat tuition cost is the true cost of what it's costing to educate those kids in that building. So it seems like the remaining towns in the co-op may then be footing some of the bill, capital costs, things of that nature for those kids that are coming back in that were already there to begin with.
Follow up, please.
Follow up?
One of the issues that has come before us has been Hollis Brookline. Hollis Brookline has come before this committee several times as far as in conversations, and the dynamics that have changed between both Hollis and Brookline with where the high school is located vis-a-vis where there's been a growth in the other community.
Right.
How does a co-op deal with that when you have that kind of
Yeah, I mean,
that kind of conflict that begins to develop?
sure. Thank you very much for the question, Representative. I mean, what often I think is not mentioned in this committee, and maybe I should do a better job of bringing it up, is there are provisions in law that allow you to amend your articles of agreement without withdrawing. You can amend your articles of agreement at any time. It takes planning and it takes some work, and you have to have a study committee and look at the numbers and bring in the DRA numbers and your business, your business manager to run the apportionment formulas. And there's also, the law allows communities, co-ops to change the apportionment formula from either, property value or students or some combination thereof. Number of heads versus what the property values are in the community. And you can do anything from 0% to 100% on any of those. So, we talked about this last session. There are provisions to change the way that the cooperative school board members are elected. Those are already allowed in law. How many districts are going through sort of changes or planning changes to amend the current and keep the status quo of the communities, but yet change with it? I have no idea. I don't know. I will tell you that NHSBA, I'd say the last 3 or 4 years, maybe even a little bit longer, because I don't know how much of this was going on during the pandemic. We work with some consultants where a board will call us and say, we think we want to withdraw, or we think we want to study withdrawal, but we're not sure we're there yet. Can you send somebody down and help us do some pre-work, if you will, before we get down the road of doing the statutory study commission and whatnot? And so, I've got some consultants, usually former business managers or former superintendents that have been in co-ops that understand sort of the nature of what a co-op is. And they'll go down and they'll do 6 months worth of work, and they say, you know what, it may not be perfect, but it's better than the alternative. We see that quite a bit as well, too.
Representative Cordelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Getting back to the point about dissolution plans in the Articles of Agreement, I think that subparagraph came into effect only as a result of the 1997 study that you referred to earlier, and that actually no co-op has been formed since that point. So, in effect, no Articles of Agreement are required to have an article related to dissolution. Would you say that is correct?
Yeah, thank you very much, Representative Cordelli. If that provision, paragraph K, I believe it is a relatively newer provision within the last, 15, 20 years or so, that would make sense then. And since we haven't, I think there's been one co-op that's been formed in the last 15, 20 years, but it was sort of an expansion. Wilton Lineborough, they were a co-op for, I believe, the middle school and high school, and there was a Wilton Elementary School and a Lineborough Elementary School. I want to say maybe 10, 12 years ago. They just made the whole thing K-12. So it really wasn't a disruption or a new town coming into anything. Same SAU, same teacher, same staff, same superintendent. But yeah, if that's a newer provision, that would make sense because we haven't had any brand new co-ops formed in decades.
Right.
Follow up?
Thank you. I think in the discussion of withdrawals, that has been the most common legislation that we have seen over the past, 10 years that I've been here, in terms of bills that have been filed.
That's
certainly they all, or the majority of them, deal with the withdrawal process, and 1399 is an example of that.
Right.
I think one of the problems, I think you said there was only a couple of withdrawals that have occurred of a single school from the cooperative. And I think one of the reasons for that is that in most cases, the larger district within the co-op, if it's a co-op district-wide vote, a small town that might want to withdraw has virtually no chance to get passage of their withdrawal. So I think that that's an inherent problem that we have with the current laws.
Sure. Not really a question, but
I would welcome your comments.
sure. Thank you very much, Representative. Yeah, we've certainly heard that the large community carries the vote. I will say, just trying to think of a couple of the communities that I know have withdrawn, just at least in my tenure at NHSBA, which gets longer and longer every year. Surrey and Sullivan both withdrew from, I believe that was the Monadnock Regional. That was maybe 15 years ago. Very small communities. Mason withdrew from Messinic, maybe 2007, 8, 9-ish. And I don't know how, and that's Greenville and New Ipswich, and I forget if there's another community in Messinic. And I don't know how big Mason is compared to all those others. So I understand that we hear that, and I understand that that's maybe a concern in some communities, but there are other examples of very small communities being able to withdraw from a co-op.
Barrett, do you have any districts contacting you and saying, okay, we want to look at our articles of agreement? There's all these 32 different co-ops, of which all those articles are different.
Yeah.
That's part of our quandary too. How do we deal with this?
We have not been asked to review them for the sake of a review. We, from time to time, and not very common, I've been asked to look at them just to see if the articles of agreement support something that they're trying to do, whether some sort of warrant article or some sort of change in something like that. But I mean, just asking us to do a review of their articles of agreement to see if what could be changed, I haven't been asked to do that. The private attorneys may have, but we haven't.
So my question is, last year we had some language, which was in one of our amendments, and it read, reapportionment of members of the cooperative school board shall be reviewed, revised, and updated no less frequently than every 10 years, and reapportions if necessary based upon the latest federal decennial census.
Right. I remember
So
that.
every 10 years, is this currently occurring? Are co-ops looking at their articles of agreement and trying to amend them to stay current with law?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're certainly reviewing them, just because this is, we're hearing more and more of this, as Representative Cordelli said. We get a lot of bills the last 10 years or so. So I think people are reviewing them. But when I say reviewing them, I don't know if that's happening in any sort of formal sense through a committee or process or anything. I think the board members are looking at them, the superintendents are looking at them, so on and so forth. In terms of the every 10 years or whatnot, I mean, again, that might be a best practice. If that were to make it into law, it would at least get people being aware of their articles of agreement and how things might need to change. But again, sort of the larger question about legislation is again, to reiterate, I would prefer to see a big study commission where all of these questions can be answered, and we can have experts come in and hopefully get some sort of clarification with the statute.
And the last question on this topic, now I'll let the others. In your knowledge, what's going on in the state from the school board perspective, are there a majority or a very few that are really having problems with their cooperative organization, school district? Are we dealing with an issue that is statewide, or are we dealing with a few districts?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd say somewhere in between. 10 years ago, I think it was a district here, a district there. Today, there's certainly more district towns at least looking at studying withdrawal, not necessarily me saying they want to withdraw, but I think maybe that gets back to your point. It was maybe we should be reviewing these articles of agreement every 10 years. You know, have something set. So, you know, doing the review process perhaps somewhat informally before we get into a formal withdrawal process, because sometimes the train starts going and it's hard to stop that train. So, you know, I don't think it's necessarily a statewide issue. I think we've certainly heard concerns from a community here or a community there. But then again, I guess that brings me back to the point that the current law already allows us to make amendments to all these sorts of things, to the way your board members are elected, the articles of agreement, the apportionment formulas, whether or not you're using property values or per student counts. There's a lot of flexibility in there, and, you know, so I think it's not as much as it was I think it's more than it was 10 years ago. I don't know if it's still a lot that it's a statewide issue.
Are there any other questions? Yes, Representative Tanner.
Thank you, and thank you for taking my question. I came into the state as a teacher right when all this was happening in the late 60s. And I was wondering if you could speak to how, at that point, the Department of Education and also the state as a whole was encouraging these co-ops, and why, and as compared to today, how the state and the New Hampshire Department of Education is supporting the co-ops.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question, Representative. I mean, you know, it may come to a surprise, but I was not alive in 1963 when these were being formulated. I had a lot less gray hair before I started coming down here every day, though. I'll tell you that. I bet the two of you did as well too. So again, my understanding, just doing some research of this throughout the course of the years, is that the co-op statute as we know it now was primarily written in 1963. And I get New Hampshire is probably a much significantly different place today than it was in 1963. But the purpose of it was basically to create regional high schools, cooperative high schools, and perhaps some middle schools, where each town would kind of retain its little elementary school, but it didn't make sense, you know, from a fiscal standpoint for every community of 1,000 people to have their own middle school and high school building. So, you know, so they regionalized to save costs, administrative costs, building costs, so on and so forth. You know, if you had the high school in your town, fantastic. If you had to drive 30, 40 minutes over the mountains, well, too bad. But if you look at the co-op map, the map of all the co-ops and the towns that are within those co-ops, you're going to find a mix of property rich and property poor towns. That was done on purpose. That was done on purpose to help share the costs, with a recognition that public education was for the greater good. So, you know, what the department's doing now in terms of co-ops, I don't know specifically. I don't, you know, if people are calling the department attorneys relative to co-op issues, I'm not aware of that, so I don't know. They call us from time to time. Again, we try, and it's interesting when a school board calls us relative to a potential co-op withdrawal, because we have to walk a very fine line, because our client, our member, is the co-op as it exists right now. And I'm obligated to not do anything or give any legal advice that may be contrary to the interest of that collective co-op body school board. So we always tell boards, look, we can help you with process, right? Timelines, and this is who's got to be on the committee and what the statute says. But we can't give any advice as to, yes, this is a good idea, or no, this is a bad idea. We can't do that. That's for the people in that community to determine. So NHS, the scope or extent of NHSBA's assistance when districts are studying withdrawal is more process driven. We can tell them, okay, this is what the statute says, this is what has to be in your plan, this is the timeline. You know, this is our best interpretation of what this statute means, but you really need to call local counsel or have, you know, a private attorney assist you with interpreting all these things, because it's not our place to do that.
Thank you. I know that the Department of Education is present here with their attorney, and perhaps we can hold that question off as far as, is the DOE engaged in any cooperative discussions with various districts at this time? And I believe they are. Yes, Representative Cordelli?
Thank you. in terms of required review, maybe your memory is better than mine, but I seem to recall that a required review of the Articles of Agreement is only required for co-ops that were formed before 1963.
Go ahead, sorry.
I was just wondering if you have recollection.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Representative. I'm just trying to do a quick
Yeah.
word search here.
I was too.
I don't recall offhand, possibly.
Okay.
I don't recall offhand, though.
Okay, all right. Secondly, if I could.
Yes.
With amendment of the Articles of Agreement, is that also a district co-op wide vote? So again,
Yeah.
a smaller district who wants a change to the articles in terms of
possibly be
apportionment might have a difficult time.
Yeah, that
getting
has to go on the warrant. It's a warrant article that would have to be voted on co-op wide among all the communities.
Right.
Yeah, there'd be a problem. Yeah. Further questions of the school? Yes, Representative Nelson.
Thank you. I've been in several of these situations when SAU 13 split from SAU 9 and also for Governor Wentworth's school district. In our town, we're in Governor Wentworth. We're a small town, 750 people, no businesses. We pay probably the highest taxes, and there's some people on this committee that pay the lowest, but that's neither here nor there. I won't look at Representative Cordelli. Good for them. But for us to have withdrawn, we have no school.
Right.
And so we were up the creek right there, and when they financed some of these new buildings,
Yeah.
there was like a 30 years
Yeah.
payment, and we had to pay out
That's
25 years. So it was pretty much impossible for us to
Right.
withdraw financially.
Yeah, yeah, I've heard of that in other communities as well too, where just that if you don't have a facility in your community, but yet there's still a bond out on the high school, you have to, and you want to withdraw, you have to pay your fair share because you were part of the co-op when they took that bond out. So you have to pay whatever your proportional share would be to, it's kind of like alimony, I guess, you know.
So Barrett, in conclusion here then from the School Boards Association perspective, you've sort of advocated that this might be addressed best through a commission study, another commission study, the last Grenier one that came up with like 10 recommendations or 10 areas they looked at.
Was that a committee or was that a commission?
That was a commission.
Was it a commission?
Yeah.
Okay.
And give me your ballpark perspective of what you think if the latter bill, which we have, which is Representative Cordelli's bill here, to just dissolve the whole situation,
Yeah.
and maybe go into the tuition program, what would be your understanding of costs that we might be looking at here? And that is always a concern to me, is the financial
Yeah.
costs the state might be walking down the path into.
You know, if you were to just dissolve all the co-ops today, I mean, my first question would be, the first thing you'd have to look at from a cost standpoint anyway, would be how many of these co-ops have outstanding bonds and who's going to pay for that, right? I mean, is it still, if we're just dissolving forced dissolution, then, and I know that that's a lengthy bill. I didn't read it since last session, so there may have been a provision in there about, you still have to, the other communities still have to pay their fair share of the bonds or whatnot. Mm-hmm. I mean, the other thing too is, there may be concerns in a community here or community there, and there may be the situation, as Representative Nelson and Representative Cordelli talk about, where the small town can't get out either because they don't have the votes or it's not fiscally prudent. That doesn't mean we need to blow up the system. Seems to be like you'd be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If the intent of that bill was just to sort of alleviate some of the concerns that we've talked about the last whatever, since I've been up here, half hour, 45 minutes or whatever it's been. I still come back that while they may not be perfect, there are alternatives currently in law that allow for changes. That may come with some challenges as well too. I won't dispute that. But I think we need to, I'll sort of address those issues as well too. If we have a study commission, so when we have, what do we have? 3, 5 co-op bills every year. We did the commission a number of years ago, and we get a couple people here, seems to be generally from some of the same communities and the same people. If we have a study commission, I mean, the first thing that I would do with that study commission is we're not talking about legislation. We're not talking about apportionment formula. We're going to do two or 3 hour listening sessions. If you're in a co-op community and you have a concern or complaint, or you think something's great and you have a model that works, come and talk to the commission, because that's what we're going to want to hear. That would be the first thing that I would do before we even got into the DRA and apportionments and voting. I'd want to hear from the people in the 32 co-ops about, are you happy? If not, what's the concern? Have you tried addressing it locally? Have you gone through the amendment process already in law? And then hear from other co-ops where things are going well and they've come up with creative solutions to help alleviate the concerns of that town or that community.
Thank you. Well, we may have a little bit of an opportunity to listen today to some that may be coming from co-ops that are having, that love it or are trying to get out of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Good morning.
Rick, before we go on, would it be valuable for this group to have a copy of that 1997 study?
Oh, yeah, I think as much information you can have. I don't have them myself.
Okay.
That'd be great. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Hi, good morning. My name's Jim O'Shaughnessy. I'm an attorney at Drummond Woodsum, which is a law firm in Manchester as well as Maine, and I represent essentially exclusively school districts, and my firm represents a lot of school districts in New Hampshire and Maine. And I think I was doing a rough estimate. Right now, we work with about 18 cooperative school districts in the state. I'm general counsel for around 10, 12 of those school districts. I've been involved in a number of study commissions, specifically working with the districts who are in the process of having a withdrawal study conducted. I've worked with also towns who have hired me to advise them on the potential for them to withdraw from a cooperative. That was a couple of years ago, I think 2019. I worked with the Charlestown school, the town of Charlestown, and their consideration of withdrawing from Fall Mountain. Okay. I've testified a number of times with the state board. I've been through a lot of those meetings. I've met with a lot of school boards, a lot of community members, select board members. So I have a really robust experience just in terms of what folks in the state are talking about. I was on the 2017 study commission where we studied the withdrawal process in 195, 25, and 26 that came up with, the Grenier's committee that came up with some recommended language that actually revised the withdrawal process and kind of streamlined it and made it a lot more clear. We did some good work, and I'll just start by saying that study commission we talked a lot. There was not a lot of expertise. There were a lot of people with interest, but there was not a lot of expertise on the commission. So we had a hard time sort of streamlining and coming up with really good solutions to some of the problems that just remained on the table. And I can talk about, where I think there are issues that are impacting both the communities looking to withdraw and the cooperative as a whole, or the communities that remain in a cooperative. I just want to clarify a couple things. There are really there's many types of cooperatives in New Hampshire, but there are really two types in terms of how they were formed. There are cooperatives that were formed prior to 1963 and prior to the adoption of 195.18, and some of those cooperatives predate the statute. They were formed by a special act of the legislature in the 1950s and 60s. Some of those cooperatives don't in fact have articles of agreement. I represent a client that does not actually have written articles of agreement. The articles of agreement are essentially what the annual meeting voters approve from time to time with respect to the apportionment formula for operating costs and capital costs. So there's the pre-1963 districts, and then there's the post-1963 districts that are subject to 195.18.
How many, excuse me for butting in, but how many
No idea.
Districts doing
I
no
can't.
idea.
I knew at one point. I can't remember.
Okay.
There's not a large number of pre-1963 districts, but there are some out there. Monadnock is a good example of a pre-1963 district. And I think if you go on the DOE website, there are often dates of formation on there, and I've counted. I just don't recall. So those. All cooperatives, the other thing I want to explain is all cooperatives are comprised of what we call pre-existing districts, because there's a lot of confusion about what happens when a school district enters into a cooperative with another school district, and unless that school district continues to operate elementary schools or other schools, it disappears. It is absorbed into the cooperative. So we often think about them as the town school district still remaining. There is no town school district, in fact, by law, if the cooperative absorbs that pre-existing school district as a member. And that's important because when a cooperative is formed and the pre-existing school districts are absorbed in the cooperative, they're a now separate entity. They're a separate municipal corporation. And the thinking behind that is they are doing it because they are putting their own individual town taxes and needs and interests aside for the collaborative, cooperative, improvement of education for all the kids in the co-op. It's a sort of holistic view of what is our responsibility as a cooperative. And that is the spirit of why a lot of these cooperatives were formed. A bit of history on that. In 1961, the legislature formed a cooperative study commission that provided the impetus for the adoption of 195.18. The commissioner at the time was a big supporter of the need to improve how we were educating primarily our high school students in particularly rural or poor communities. And so the Department of Education was very supportive of let's get out there and form these cooperatives and combine these school districts and regionalize education. And so the 1961 study, which is available, I have a copy. I think I copied it from the state library because my mentor, John Tague, was very involved in studying that. And that document really is the sort of the driving force behind the Commissioner of Education going out and actually doing the matchmaking and putting the districts together. And you probably are aware at the time that the legislature offered a lot of building aid for school districts to build their cooperative schools. That probably was the biggest motivating factor for cooperatives forming in the 60s. I'm happy to answer questions. There's a lot of things I could go through. You asked the question, is this a statewide issue or is this a sort of individual issue? I did a rough estimate, of the districts I work with. Less than a third of them have contemplated or have had a withdrawal study commission in the last 5-10 years. So I wonder if that's a kind of a relevant number. Like a third of the state has sort of gone through the process of saying, should we talk about withdrawal? Should we revise our apportionment formula? About a third of my districts have gone through that process from time to time. Withdrawal and the apportionment process, those are subject to votes by the legislative body, and it all turns on who shows up at the ballot to vote, or who shows up at the annual meeting to vote. It is inherently a democratic process, and there are always winners and losers, and some folks are unhappy with losing, and it's a really tough thing because the withdrawing town has to approve and the cooperative has to approve. We decided that once and for all when in that commission and when the legislature passed the revisions to 195.25. That's really the thing that is holding a lot of it back, is getting both bodies to understand and to vote appropriately. This is an incredibly complicated process. There are so many facets, and every cooperative has its own different political dynamic. There's so many legal issues, there's dollars involved. It's incredibly hard from my perspective, advising superintendents and school boards about what you're doing, what are the implications, what are the documentation, what's the work you have to do to study this. It's very, very challenging. Imagine how much more challenging it is than to roll that out to all the voters so everyone understands here's what we're sitting down and voting on today. That's the big challenge, is it's complicated. So I think Barrett answered the question correctly. The way to do this is for those study commissions to slow down, to put in the work, and not try to rush it or wait to the last minute, because a lot of times it's not a professional package when it's proposed at the end of the day. And that's often the complaint when it goes before the state board or it goes before the voters, that this was sort of a half-baked effort. It was thrown together at the last minute. The numbers aren't accurate. There's not enough detail in the withdrawal report. The dollars weren't calculated correctly. There's assumptions that are often made that the withdrawing district's kids will still get to continue to go to the cooperative high school, which is not a guarantee under the law. So there's so many assumptions made in these half-baked withdrawal reports that the voters aren't confident in them. And often that's the reason why they fail, in my experience. I wanted to talk a little bit. I know we've talked sort of generally. I wanted to dig in a little bit on the actual legislation. 1679, the dissolution bill. I mean, from a legal perspective, I think that's just a non-starter, no offense, but I can't even possibly fathom how that could happen. I think it's interesting to throw this idea out for sort of conceptual reasons, but for me, it's unfathomable, because I don't know how all those districts would then negotiate all those tuition agreements with all the high schools. The cost would be astronomical, and ultimately and fundamentally politically, you have a legislature making decisions for the local communities. I feel like that's a local community decision, and it just really ought to remain a local community decision. I think 1399 is an interesting bill, because it attempts for the first time to fix some of the issues that exist in the statute with respect to the disposition of property after a withdrawal. And this gets into the nitty-gritty. And this is where I'm telling you, everybody gets really confused and all wrapped up in what does the law mean and what does the law say. But 195-28 is the statute that really relates to what happens to the property in the districts that are withdrawing from a co-op. So if I don't know what example we're using right now that makes sense, and that's sort of an easy one to think about, but let's say you have a multi-district cooperative made up of several pre-existing towns, and it covers K through 12, preschool through 12. There are all kinds of co-ops out there, but let's just take that simple model. K through 12, multi-pre-existing school district cooperative in one town has an elementary school, and they withdraw. What happens with that elementary school? Who pays whom for what, and how much, is really what 195-28 talks about. And so the current language in 195-28 that I think throws a wrench in the process is the withdrawing district gets title to their property. They get title to their school. It's transfer of ownership from cooperative back to the town after withdrawal. You get it now. You become your own district. You're reformed as a district. You get your school. Only after it pays the cooperative for all of the capital expenditures, improvements that the cooperative has made throughout the history of its existence. That's a pretty daunting, I mean, in 1960, whatever, 3 or 1977, when they came up with that, the co-ops were 15, 20 years old. So it was like, all right, that makes sense. Well, now we're looking back at 60 years ago, there was a new roof put on that building that's been replaced twice, but now we're expected to reimburse the co-op for the capital outlay for the roof. It doesn't make sense. So as a result, we end up kind of fudging the numbers, or saying, well, we'll look back 30 years or some other amount of time. But the fact is, the dollar amount at the end of the day is huge. And it's huge dollars regardless of the condition of the school, how much what its actual value might be. It's not a value based, it's just the actual money spent. So 1399 proposes a different method, but it's not a good method either. It's closer to being a good method, but it's not a good method because it says that the withdrawing district gets paid for its proportional share of the net equity in the remaining buildings, and then the cooperative has to pay them to get their bill. The current law states that, so it says, hold on, takes its buildings with them and must pay back to the other members of the co-op each member's proportional share in the net equity. So the building is appraised, and the withdrawing district only has to pay back the entire co-op for its proportional share of the value of the building. So it's like it only has to pay like this tiny amount. So let's say that elementary school is worth $1 million, and there are 5 districts. They only have to pay $400,000. Is that the right math? Right. They only have to pay this tiny amount, yet they're getting the full value of their building back that the cooperative paid for. So that method isn't fair either, because it really it's very one-sided. It just favors the withdrawing district's interest over that of the co-op and the remaining towns. They're basically getting the bad end of the stick. The withdrawing district is getting its building back for a song. So what makes more sense to me is that the withdrawing district has to pay the co-op for the actual value of the building. You're getting your building, what's it worth? Pay the co-op, you get your building. That's almost what 1399 accomplishes, but it doesn't get there. It could get there. I have another concern with 1399. Section 2 talks about the value of property being appraised by a 3-person committee. It's a fine idea. I'm sure we could sort of nitpick that idea of an appraisal. The problem as I see it in 2 is it doesn't actually dictate what the appraisal method is. Are we going to base it on fair market value? What's the fair market value of a school building built in 1920 that has a new roof? You know what I mean? Like, there is no really good market or way to calculate fair market value. If you ask real estate appraisers to appraise the fair market value of old elementary school buildings, they're all over the place. And I don't think that serves anybody, because you could end up with an astronomically high number or a really weird low number. So to me, the better method is like the cost. You take the replacement cost. So what would it cost to build a new school minus depreciation, which is a method they use in a lot of similar circumstances. So that's a different and maybe a better way of calculating what the value is of that old school building. Replacement cost minus depreciation, because it would cost $20 million in today's dollars to buy that school, but we've had it for 40 years. So what's the current value today? That's an appropriate appraisal method. Part 2 doesn't dictate an appraisal method. It needs to. I don't think we should delegate that to a 3-person committee without the legislature saying what that method should be. I'm not saying I know for sure, but I'm giving an example of one potentially better method that would be fair to the withdrawing district, and that would be fair to the remaining members of the co-op.
Before you go to the next bill.
Yep.
1399, what happens if the building which is in the withdrawing district is not owned by the co-op district, but owned by the withdrawing district?
It's not. It's not a possibility.
That exists.
Are you talking about Woodsville?
No,
Haverhill?
No, I'm from Woodsville, Haverhill. I'm not. Haverhill and Woodsville are fine with their co-op.
So
but we have another district in the state where they own the building, one of the buildings, which is an elementary building. They own it. Clear. The village district owns it.
The statute doesn't address that. It might be really simple. If the withdrawing school district owns the building, and that's actually clear, and there's no dispute about it. And by the way, title and ownership is one of those really sometimes difficult things to prove.
Well, there's no question on this.
All right.
I'll let you know its town is Bridgewater.
Okay.
And they have title, ownership, no debt on their building.
So the answer is why do they have to pay anything back to the co-op if they own the property, other than the cost of capital improvements maybe that the co-op made?
To other buildings?
No, to that
To
building they
their
own.
building, to their building, yes.
Yeah, there's got to be some reimbursement to the co-op for the improvements that the co-op paid, but in what
Co-ops made no maintenance has been paid by Bridgewater.
that doesn't seem that confusing to me from just a logical standpoint, and the statute doesn't address that currently.
They're a co-op, they go to Newfound for beyond the elementary grades.
Yes. So
which is K through
19528 addresses the disposition of property owned by the co-op, not owned by other entities. So that it's not really, it's a completely separate issue, and Bridgewater can hire their own lawyer and their lawyer can tell them what
What
happens
happens
to their
if that
property.
building's leased to the co-op for $1 a year?
That's subject to the terms of the lease agreement. Again,
And
not
that's occurring.
not part of 19528. So it's a separate contractual arrangement. I don't want to weigh in on the contract between Bridgewater and a school district, but that's one of those 1 year 99-year leases for $1. It's still a property interest that the co-op has in the use of the building, so they have to figure out how to deal with terminating that lease. But that's between those entities.
I
It's not
think that's
addressed by
written
the
in the
statute.
agreement every 5 years.
Yeah, so that's not part of 19528.
Okay.
The other part of 1399, which is very one-sided and it's just going to frustrate efforts for withdrawal, is it says that the withdrawing district takes its school buildings with them, but must pay back to the other members each member's proportional share in the net equity of the co-op buildings. So current law states that the withdrawing district must pay the co-op back for the actual cost of capital improvements. We've already talked about that. I think one of the
Can you explain that again? Because is it in the co-op buildings?
So if there are schools, if the withdrawing town leaves and there are other schools in the co-op, it says the withdrawing district gets paid for its proportional share in the value of the rest of the buildings.
Okay.
So it's leaving,
Yeah.
it's abandoning the co-op. There's all this property. The withdrawing district under 1399 would get paid
Yeah.
for its proportional interest in the buildings that it's abandoning. Current law says, withdrawing district, if you leave, you're forfeiting your equity in all the buildings that are left in the co-op. You keep your own, you pay for your own building, but you forfeit your equity in the other buildings. It's meant to be a little bit difficult to withdraw. This system kind of flips it around and says, well, you get paid back for whatever equity you have in the remaining buildings. And the reason that's unfair is that the pre-existing districts in the co-op, I get stung twice because they have to cut a check to the pre-existing district that just withdrew, right? Mm-hmm. And they have to continue paying for the operating costs of those districts even after that one of their members leaves.
And the debt?
And the debt, these guys are, the withdrawing district will still have some indebtedness obligation,
Yeah.
but this is assuming there's no debt.
Okay.
So the co-op has to cut a check and they have to continue operating the building with one of its members gone. That's just going to make the co-op's never going to vote in support of that kind of a withdrawal plan because it saddles them twice with the money. They got to cut a huge check and they have to keep operating with that member gone. So that provision, I think, doesn't work. And there probably is a better provision, but that's really that's part 3 of 1399. Part 5 of 1399 addresses the assumption of indebtedness. It says upon payments, the cooperative district shall transfer and convey title to any building. The pre-existing district, remember the district that withdrew, shall assume any remaining indebtedness for such school building, land, or facilities. It's really easy to say that and be like, oh, that's nice and clean. The problem is that if they withdraw with their building, but the bond was issued by the cooperative, it's not just a matter of saying, all right, now we have the bond as the town of of Acme. No, you can't just transfer bonds back and forth. That actually undercuts the entire bond. And I have bond counsel in my firm, and we've spoken to them about this. But simply stating that doesn't address the consequences of how you transfer bond debt between municipalities. The risk here is huge, because if you do it improperly, then the bond loses its tax exempt status. And all of a sudden the municipality assumes the indebtedness, but also the bond is no longer tax exempt. So that municipality has to pay taxes that they haven't paid. I'm not doing a sort of doom and gloom thing. I'm just saying, you peek under the bond stuff and you look at the arbitrage rules for bonds, it's a very complicated area of the law. There's not a lot of people in the state who do it. And I just would say be very cautious about dealing with transferring debt between one municipality which issued the bond to another municipality which didn't exist when the bond was issued. It's not that simple. And I'm going to leave it there, because I'm not a bond attorney. I don't even pretend to be one. And I have a couple of, we have a municipal finance group in our office, and I'll refer it to them when I get a call. I think, I know Barrett said this and you're already talking about this. I think a study commission of co-ops is like so long overdue, right? It's been since the 1990s, and we are a different state. We have a different view on school choice in New Hampshire. Things cost a lot more money than they cost back in the 90s, and certainly back in the 60s. We need a commission. We need people on the commission from different parts of the state, and also different areas of expertise that can advise the commission on these complex issues. I think that's where at least 1399, which has some potential. And I'm not even going to really address 1366. That's really just a political thing in my view. And 1679 is a non-starter. But with respect to 1399 and some of the remaining issues that co-ops are encountering, a commission is, I think, a really good idea. I'd be happy to attend. I'd happy to sit on it. I was on the 2017 commission and offer my assistance, just because I find this to be really interesting work primarily. And also, I think the state needs to figure some of these issues out. And I'll stay for questions, but thank you.
Thank you very much. Informative. Questions? Yes, Representative Cornell.
Thank you. Thank you for taking my question. You said on the last commission, some of the things didn't come out right because there wasn't the knowledge that should have been there. So if we did recommend another commission, like what kind of background or people should be on that commission?
I think someone from the DRA who can advise with respect to appraisals, someone familiar with, real estate appraisals potentially, folks in the community who want to put the legwork into figuring out how to deal with the debt and the bond issue. I think those are big concerns. I think the idea that Barrett raised was a good idea, that we want to hear from the community members to figure out what the issues are, because what happens is, one person from this cooperative who lives in this town has this perspective on co-ops. This person from this town has a totally different perspective on co-ops. There are some co-ops that are just high schools. There are some that are middle school through high school. There are some that are K through 12. And so everyone really does have a different experience. And so last time we spent almost all of our time just trying to understand the nature of the beast. And then all the work about how to fix it, we tried to kind of do really quickly. And it really resulted in a couple of bills. But one amendment came out of the commission that we thought was going to really work. And that ended up resulting in the change to 195.18. But I think it's going to take longer. It's going to take more work to really understand, for all the people to understand the nature of the co-ops.
Jim, I see on that commission, I have that membership in front of me right now, that occurred on the Grenier. There was representation from the Department of Revenue Administration. Did they bring that type of expertise in, or do you need somebody more specifically, dealing
Stephen
with?
Hamilton was present.
Yes.
He was very kind with his time. He did a quick overview of some of the issues, but it wasn't really digging in like someone who could really just dig in and help out and come up with stuff like solutions and language. I mean, he was helpful, but I'm not sure he really knew what the DRA's role was. And so he provided a helpful overview. I know there was a representative from the DOE who's here today, and there was help from that end too. But it has to be at the outset. There has to be an intention to kind of fix some of these problems, identify what they are, fix them, but first understand what the nature is of all these co-ops in the state.
Thank you. Yes, Representative Cornell.
If every co-op is different and has different contracts or agreements, would a commission even be able to come up with a solution for all of them of how to do things when they're all different? Or should it just be local control and the people getting together from those co-ops and making decisions for themselves, rather than us telling them what to do?
I think there's a framework right now, and the framework allows for local control amendment of articles of agreement, but there are some provisions that really tie people's hands. And some of those provisions, for example, the disposition of property language, do tie the hands of the study of the potentially withdrawing towns. They do tie the hands of the cooperative that would remain in place. So we should be looking at how, with a lighter touch, can we modify some of those restrictions without really kind of taking the whole thing apart and starting all over again. I don't think we need to do that.
Yes, Representative Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, sir, for taking our questions. To what extent does geography play a factor in this, and such as two elementary schools owned by a co-op, one's in one town, one's in the other, but one's a new building and the other one's an old building, and you start trying to decide who gets what when you divide all this?
Yeah, I mean, geography and socioeconomic demographics, I think, play a huge part. And what ends up happening in my experience is cooperatives, it's not everyone, but some people in the community have a different idea than other people in the community about what's fair and what's right. And so, for instance, sometimes you look at the cost, the operating cost of the district in apportionment formulas, and you'll hear members of the community saying, well, my per pupil cost in my town is $28,000 and the per pupil cost in that other town is only, $18,000. And that has to do with the equalized valuation. And if the property with more equalized valuation, they're going to have a higher per pupil cost because they have higher property values and more ability to pay that high per pupil cost. But they'll think that's unfair because they're looking at the cost per student. Whereas some people will say, well, that's fair because you have the ability to raise that money in your community. And we're doing this together, and we agreed we're going to do this together. So it really comes down to how people think about, philosophically, what's fair. What's more important, my town or the collective cooperative as a whole? That's, I think, the most important issue. And whether you're in Pittsfield or Hollis or, Keene, Monadnock, or, Winnicott, it's always the same conversation. I go to 20, 30 school district meetings every year, and it's the same conversations. And people are very smart all across the state, and they're very tied in with these issues, and it's always a very similar conversation.
Thank you. That's so. It's a heavy topic. The prior chair of Ways and Means, or now retired, was very concerned about what we were doing last year because he came from one of those towns you just mentioned that had the dollars and well, I won't go any further than that, but it's really this whole conversation can end up like a donor town versus non-donor town type discussion.
It is a miniature version of that. I mean, the co-ops, like Barrett said, they were a marriage between, not rich and poor. I don't want to, but the towns that didn't have a lot of property value were put with the towns that did. Because, and so it is literally a miniature version of New Hampshire.
Sure is. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Informative as usual.
Thank you.
Are there any folks from specific co-ops that have issues that would like to discuss those or present those issues to us? Everybody's copacetic? Good. Is there anybody else would like to present, information to the study committee at this time? Yes, Representative Tanner?
Can we hear from the Department of Education?
Yes, I was going to do that after we, Okay, good morning, Ms. Fenton. Yes.
I think there was another superintendent.
I'm happy to yield to the DOE after that.
Okay, she's playing her cards well. Diana?
As you all know, the only thing that makes having one attorney is having two attorneys. So I'm happy to introduce Liz Brown. She's also with the Department of Education. For the record, my name is Diana Fenton. I'm an attorney with the Department of Education. It's always nice to see everyone. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I always love when Representative Tanner has a question for me because I know it's going to be a good one. So I, like Barrett, was not around in the 60s, hard to believe. I can tell you during my tenure with the Department of Education that we have received calls from districts asking questions about the statute, similar to what Barrett testified to. We do not represent any particular district, and so I guide them the best I can through the law, walk them through that process. We always encourage the districts to speak to their local council and have that person assist them with that process. We really can't do a very deep dive on it. It is for that district to reach out to their council. But what we largely do is kind of assist them with the paperwork and getting it ready to go in front of the state board. And so that's where I myself have assisted many districts in just making sure that the formalities and the paperwork are appropriate for the state board. I can't recall the last time that we had a withdrawal come before the state board, but I can tell you that when they have come before the state board, one of the areas of concern that I would encourage this committee to look at, regardless of which legislative path you take on the bills before you, is to think about what role the State Board of Education plays in this process. And what I mean by that is all this paperwork comes in front of the state board, and the state board has historically kind of said in fewer words perhaps, well, what do we do with this? What is our analysis? How deep can we dive on this? And I know sometimes the state board in the past has felt like it is simply an administrative rubber stamp, that the work has been done and now they just have to approve it and send it along. Other times the board, which as you all know, changes in terms of its makeup, other times the board has pushed back and asked some questions. What's going to happen with this piece of property? Where are the students going to go? And so, depending on the formation of the board, you're going to get very different questions asked. But that has been kind of an area that the board has struggled with, perhaps. I'm sure, and again, I'm not here to speak on behalf of the Board of Education, but I'm sure clarity as to what that role should be and is would be appreciated. Along your lines, to further answer your question, Representative Tanner, we have received calls from constituents who are upset about their cooperative, wanting to withdraw from it, explaining that it's an unfair process.
It's a marriage that cannot end.
it is a marriage that cannot end. I have, in the past, I have been sent to school board meetings of various cooperatives. I went to Jaffrey Ringe for a school board meeting where their cooperative was having some issues. I've been to Orford down in Vermont, New Hampshire border. I'm trying to address some of these issues. I think the role the department plays is somewhat limited, and it is always just coming back to the law and what is allowed under the law. We are not there to advise. We are not there to guide. So a lot of the time I spend listening to the concerns and trying to direct the best I can. So I have made those trips myself to various times, but I do so with another attorney from a firm such as Jim O'Shaughnessy or other firms that represent districts in that capacity and really defer to that individual. So sometimes I'm not sure how helpful my role is, but yes, I have been to those meetings.
There was a question that was asked earlier about, and I just want to make sure that I address the point. And I'll give you a little background of who I am and how I ended up here, because I think I was involved in that last withdrawal study, and it's just sort of by a
So
dumb
you
luck.
are the Elizabeth on this.
I am the Elizabeth Brown
Okay,
of that
I
withdrawal
was
study.
gonna ask that question.
I believe I was roped in by two attorneys that are behind me, one to my right and one to my left. At the time, I believe I may have been the chair of the Hollis Brookline Cooperative School District. I was the chair for about 3 years. I was on the board for almost 9 before I was hired by the commissioner to be counsel to the Department of Education. I've only been at the department now since June, so I'm still relatively new, and so I fielded far less calls, I guess, from constituents and school districts than Diana has in her last several years. I think we met originally when I was active on the board.
We met on the study commission.
So we've had these conversations for a while. So I have a pretty good understanding of at least one co-op, and I have been on the study commission and kind of remember the work. And I think that the work that Barrett and Jim previously described and how that committee went would be an accurate description of how I would describe that work. It was a lot of work tried to be done in a very short amount of time after there was a lot of venting, because we learned that the co-ops were all very, very different, and they all come. But one of the questions I want to make sure that I address, just so you know, in my short tenure, there was, and ironically, I was on the board that had the relook at our Articles of Agreement. So back about 8 months ago, the Hollis Brookline Cooperative had a special meeting to have a vote on amending the Hollis Brookline Cooperative Agreement, Articles of Agreement, because it became apparent to some members of the board that they were kind of outdated. There was just things that didn't reflect what we did. They didn't reflect the times. They didn't reflect current law. So those were amended by like a special meeting of the co-op. There was a vote, and then those Articles of Agreement just came before the State Board of Education in July, and those were reviewed. So there are co-ops that are actively reviewing them and going through that full process. I don't know if there's other, but that is one that I've encountered since I've been employed by the board of
The Department
of Education and advising the board. Yeah, sorry. Maybe more coffee would be a good idea this morning. But that is one that has come before us in the last 3 months while I've been at the department, just so you are aware of that one.
Thank you. During the time you were doing that, I sat beside in the House a representative that came from Brookline, and I heard about co-op issues every day I was sitting in session. I won't mention his name.
You
but
don't need to.
you know who I'm talking about. Okay, so then the question I have to you, and of course, you're one of 3 that were on the previous commission in this room right now.
4 of us.
4 of you on it?
The 2 of us and Barrett and Jim.
Okay, and so I've heard just recently from the prior speaker here that it would be a good idea to have a commission study to eliminate some of the confused language within law and help streamline that. Are you of the same opinion?
I actually think that would be a good idea. I think that would be a comprehensive look, because each of these statutes impact other statutes. For example, if we looked at and I don't remember the House bill, but the House bill that would basically eliminate all the cooperative, 1697, that would have impact on things like building aid. And so it needs to be a comprehensive look. Once you change one statute that deals with co-ops, it's going to change 2 or 3 other statutes that are not in the cooperative statute, realm. They're going to change other things. So it needs to be a much more comprehensive look. And I actually think Vera's suggestion of having, allowing some districts to come in and talk and vent, and because I have had a district come before me at this point already, as while I've been at the department, really being in that unhappy marriage because they're a small district that can't effectuate the change because they can't get enough votes. But I do think there's a lot of different flavors of co-ops, and I think that might be a really good place to start in examining these, but also allow a more comprehensive and careful look at how a change in one statute would impact a number of other non-cooperative related statutes.
Yes, Representative Myler.
Yeah, I think we've talked about a commission, and I think that's the right way to go. And it's important to note, it's a commission, not a legislative committee.
Yeah.
Because there's a huge difference between the voices that are in the room in a legislative committee vis-a-vis that of a commission, where you have people from the public who are engaged in the commission work where you can't in a legislative committee. And I think it's important to have those voices there because there is vested interest in there and there's experience that those of us that are in the legislative part of it don't have. So I would concur that as we look at this, Mr. Chairman, that we continue to focus on the commission work and not a legislative committee work.
Well, that's why, when I did appoint Jim Grenier as the chair of that, it was a commission study and we saw that. And I think that what you're saying is absolutely so, that we want the expertise out there. We've muddled around for this for so long. We need to have some of that. We need some accountants on there, some people that can assess things properly and give us the information we really need to make a good statute, good law. So are there any further questions for either attorneys Brown and Fenton? Yes, Representative Tanner.
Thank you. And thank you for taking my question. Just as a follow-up, you talked about how your actions at the State Department of Education seem to be reactive to the issues that are coming to you. And as I pointed out in my ancient, dinosaur years, that in the 60s, when, for example, the Kearsarge District formulated, there were a lot of incentives and the Department of Education was really supporting co-ops in many, many ways, as talking to the, they had meetings and conferences with the teachers that were going into that co-op, how to work with the different schools coming together. There was building aid, that sort of thing. Today, what's happening at the Department of Education, if anything, to support the co-ops or to simply react to the questions of breaking up co-ops?
I don't think there are any actions that you have described which occurred when they were being formed, nor would it seem appropriate for the department to undertake that work since they have been formed. I think that was a reaction of that particular time. So I think that the support that the department offers is the support that we offer to all school districts, and it's just kind of a holistic approach. But there's nothing particular to cooperatives such as you have described that is being undertaken, to the best of my knowledge.
Are there, yes, Representative Blackus.
We had a bit of a list started as to who should be on this commission. Do you have any to add to it?
Well, I would recommend Jim O'Shaughnessy. I was fascinated by his testimony. As you know, the department, we provide information, and so it's a rare occasion when I would say to you, certainly this person, certainly that person. But there are a lot of people out here clearly that have a lot of really valuable information about cooperatives. And that's the information that needs to be presented to this committee. And I would encourage you to reach out to those resources, namely when Attorney O'Shaughnessy mentioned that attorney at his firm that works with bonds. That's critical information to bring forward to this committee. And I can tell you that is a very specialized area. Certainly falls far outside of my purview. And that's the kind of detailed information that this committee would need, and those resources and those people are out there. My experience from the last study commission in 2017, it was that it felt very rushed. It felt very rushed, and I think the subtext of all the testimony today is that this is an area that needs a very thoughtful approach. And to address Representative Cornell's concern and questions, I think that formula or that guidance or that blueprint, as I like to call it, can be achieved. I think that right balance can be struck, but it's going to take some time. And what we've seen over the legislative sessions, every session there's a bill or two that deals with cooperatives. And you know that it's a problem. This legislative committee knows it is an issue, and what it needs is a very thoughtful approach, and that sometimes just takes time. And I would encourage this committee to do that. It is a worthwhile endeavor.
The previous commission, the charge and study purpose was a singular sentence here with a couple bullets underneath. It said the commission shall study issues relating to the withdrawal of pre-existing districts from their cooperative school district, including. If we go with a commission, would you recommend that there be the study the issues relating to cooperative school districts, period?
I think that based upon the comments we've heard today, I think that would be more comprehensive, although I think that might be too large. I mean, maybe we need to consider, is it what all issues we want, it's withdrawal, disillusion, which are different, but it certainly needs to include both of those, and maybe include, finance and some other issues that could be apportionment of board seats. I don't know if you want to go as broad as just simply the study of cooperatives. I think that might become overwhelming, and you might have a 5-year study commission rather than a 2-year. So there's got to be a balance between what I think was very, very narrow in that prior study.
Liz, could you get together with Jim and Barrett and others that are involved with this and try to draw up a list of bullets that we might want to consider as a body here?
Sure.
Yeah. Yes, Dave.
Yeah. Thanks, Rick. I think also the components that go into articles of agreement probably need to be more completely laid out, and then I liked Jim O'Shaughnessy's language with a little bit of a light touch to the definition and characteristics of for each of those points. Going back a million years to my commerce days, we did some similar things in condo law, where two very different things here, but condo agreements were all over the place, and Chair Hunt really did, with I think a fairly light touch, provide.
John had a light touch.
I had a light. Well, John,
Okay.
and it does fall into the contracts position, but to put some sort of framework and some blueprint, as Patty calls it, to to these things. I think we've got a a record of being able to do things like this. So I think what you're all suggesting is terrific.
And I think at this point, the 2017 Study Commission, to the best of my recollection, there's been an enormous focus on the history of cooperatives, kind of the question of how did we get here? And I think those questions have been answered. I think there's been a lot of discussion about that, and I think it's been most appreciated to understand the how did we get here. And now I think as a legislative committee, as a group of citizens, we're ready for the next logical step, which is where do we go from here? And so I think that's where the study committee can kind of pivot a little bit in its work to the broader understanding of, so now what? How do we work with what we have? We understand how it got formed, and now we need to pivot a little bit in our analysis.
We've heard that some districts may not have articles of agreement if they were formed prior to. Should they all have articles of agreement? Yeah.
Maybe.
So
Well, I think.
well, that's a question maybe we have to ask, and
Yeah.
that's our decision here. But
Representative Ladd, I think we all need to take a moment to recognize you asked a question that stumped two lawyers, not just one. So that's very
I'm going to
impressive.
get ask two lawyers. I'll get three answers.
Exactly. We
But
both
the
looked
answer
at each other
always
like-
is, it depends.
So, but that is one of the considerations is there has to be a recognition that there are cooperatives formed before the statute was created, and how will they be affected by it? And I know I worked with Senator Reagan on creating a bill from the 2017 commission that was recognized that difference, and so I think we put in a time frame on that moving forward. So these are all things, considerations for the study commission to think about.
Okay, thank you very much. Further questions for our attorneys here?
So Rick,
Well, I
think we had another answer to my.
I actually had another
Oh,
question,
okay.
answer to her question. I think that you want to make sure you've got some educators at the table. Because in many of the discussions that I've heard, maybe in my non-legal capacity, it's become a math question, whether we should continue in a co-op versus an education question. It is a comprehensive question, and we always have to keep it in the context of it is a school and we're trying to educate kids. So we definitely want to make sure that we're including educators in that conversation, and what types of courses, rigor, and curriculum can we offer in a co-op versus individual districts, and that at least be part of the factors that are considered in that conversation, so we don't get too wrapped up in DRA and formulas and property values. That we also remember this is an education bill.
so Rick, if I may, in summary then, are we asking the attorneys present here, and I would also add perhaps a superintendent or two, to get together and come back to this group with some recommendations on what that commission task might be, as well as the composition of individual types to be on that commission? Is that what we're asking these folks
We'll
to do?
take all the input from them and we can get, but however, when it comes down to the basic policies, like, if policy people on there, we'll make those decisions.
I understand that.
But I think, yes, we are asking them,
Okay.
what are some of the charges, the duties that this group needs to cover? If it's too broad, we probably won't get anywhere, but if it's going to nail down what we've discussed here today, I'd welcome their input on membership and what those charges should be. And I think that's the first step to trying to tackle this thing in a way that perhaps we haven't tackled it in the past.
And we would be happy to do that. We'll provide that.
I know the legislature is getting tired of having so many committees and commissions. I can't even identify the number that I'm on. And it's, you wonder, are we really achieving anything? I think we can achieve something with this if it's done properly. Because we hear that maybe 1/3 of our folks out there in co-ops may have issues one way or another. Well, that's a number which I think's high, and and we got to resolve that. And that's, if we're going to do something, this might be the way to do it. Further questions? I'm not missing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else today, superintendents from the education policy side, anything like that? Anything to present or just make us aware of?
Kimberly Rizzo Saunders. I'm the superintendent of Conval. And I just want to piggyback on something Attorney Brown said, and that is that this sounds and is beginning to feel like it's a math problem. But the truth is that the cooperative school districts work under articles of agreement, most of them. Our articles of agreement in Conval have to be reviewed every 3 years. Our articles of agreement in Conval include a representative committee of all the selectmen of the towns. So there are articles of agreement that represent what I think you might be looking for. But more important than that is any commission or any study that the legislature decides to do should also include the softer side, if you will, which I know for some of you is very hard to talk about. And that is that at the end of the day, each co-op also has an identity. In the 55 years that the Conval co-op has been together, the people in our towns, in the 9 towns that we serve, identify themselves as belonging to the Conval school district. That happens because many, particularly larger co-ops, become the state in miniature. They become miniature municipalities. And people identify as from that area. Where are you from? I'm from the Conval School District. Not all co-ops, I think this was misspoken. Not all co-ops have multiple districts. Some co-ops are simply one district, like the Kentucky Valley School District. So I was a little confused. I don't know if someone misspoke. They were built on cost sharing. They're built on providing the best education to students, the best resources to students, and they're built on local control. And that's important to those miniature states, that they are allowed to control their destinies. So as you're considering a commission, you should also remember that you are entering into an area where many of these towns have had 55 years of local control over their cooperative school district. And many of them have agreements around dissolution. For instance, in our cooperative district, we have one town that should the building no longer be used for educational purposes, it gets returned to the town. We have another agreement with a different town. They own the property, but we own the building. Sounds like a condo, doesn't it? So please be aware as you begin to look and pull back the layers of the onion that there are multiple types of agreements. There are multiple types of co-ops. And while every co-op is a little different, of course they have similarities. Many of our co-ops, if you look carefully about where they are, have been designed because of their rural locations. So if you do create a commission, I would highly encourage you to consider having somebody on there that understands rural communities, that understands, is an expert in rural education because it is different than urban education, and understands rural economics because the rural poor are different than the urban poor and the suburban poor. Finally, I want to just follow through on a narrative that has continued through each of these testimonies, and that's the idea that a co-op is a marriage. Certainly, there are all types of marriages, and when you're hanging out with your friends, you may complain about your marriage. That doesn't mean you don't want to be in it. It doesn't mean that, and at the base of it, there are problems. Although I'd like to see a marriage that doesn't have them. And it's certainly, I don't think anyone in the room would say,
gosh, marriage has its problems. Let's dissolve the institution.
Thank you. My colleague is very bold in wanting to speak first. I hesitate to try and follow that up, so thank you. Secondly, I also stand between you and I believe lunch, so it puts me in a precarious position to begin. My name is David Ryan. I'm superintendent in SAU 16, representing 6 towns. There's a difference between an SAU, as you know, and a cooperative school district. The Exeter Region Cooperative School District was formed in 1996. Also, that the 6 towns could send their students coming from their local elementary schools to a high achieving middle school and a high achieving high school. They've been working under an area agreement, which, as you know, has limited governing ability for the legislative body of each of those towns submitting students to those schools. Budgets are typically set by the local board. Tuitions are set, and those tuitions are then paid. Having worked also in SAU 53, we experienced that 1 year particularly, where our Pembroke voters and our Allenstown, Epsom, and Chichester voters, along with the voters of Deerfield, differed on what the costs were going to be for tuition at Pembroke Academy. We don't experience that now as a cooperative school district. So the middle school, the cooperative middle school, was built in 1998, and then the high school followed with 2004. Cooperative middle school is in the town of Stratham. The high school is in the town of Exeter. So the issue of dissolution becomes even more problematic with the transfer of a building, should there be a dissolution, of 2 cooperative buildings built in the spirit of sharing costs and achieving higher levels of rigor for all students. So that's a question in my mind. And I'm going to make my attempt to stay in my lane as representing just SAU 16, but I share my colleagues' concern for those north of this city and the representation that they have or have not, and the obstacles that they face in the North Country in trying to educate students at high levels. I'm fortunate right now to be working on the task force for minimum academic standards. And in that task force, we've been working through a framework of equity to ensure that all students are achieving at high levels and that we have policy that surrounds those outcomes for all kids, leaving it to local school districts to make the decision and choices on how students achieve those high levels. So local control remains strong, but as a state trying to enact policy that makes sure that every single student has the same opportunities for high level outcomes. Some may not get there, not all will get there, but they'll all have the same opportunity and expectations. We believe our cooperative school district does the same thing in the Seacoast region. In the town of Brentwood, we have a K through 5 school, as we do in 4 of our other 5 towns. In the town of Exeter, we have 2 elementary schools, a K to 2 and a 3 to 5. All knowing that they're going to be moving on together to cooperative middle school for those who choose to move on to cooperative middle school. In the event that we were to eliminate either the cooperative middle school and or Exeter High School, each of those districts would still then they're required to educate their students at the secondary level. And as the superintendent who provides the services under the SAU for those 6 communities, we would be forced to negotiate tuition agreements for all secondary services. Some of the issues, and this goes back to Representative Myler's question, thank you, with regard to cost, is we work through a transportation budget that requires us to have a double run of our buses in order to adequately afford this expansive square footage or square mileage of our communities to get kids to school on time. In the event that we're not able to provide that because the dissolution of the cooperative takes place, we're now required to negotiate individual transportation contracts with each of our 6 communities. And keep in mind, they would not all be going to the same destination. There's Epping High School, there's Sanborn, there would certainly still be Exeter. There could be Dover, there could be whatever the tuition agreements that these communities want to come up with. As a resident of Hooksett, in SAU 15, my own children have attended Manchester High School, so my last one will attend and graduate from Central High School this year. Not all students in the town of Hooksett are going to Manchester. As you know, they had a tuition agreement as well. We had no say in the budget. We had no say in representation on the boards. And so the decisions that were being made in the city of Manchester were those decisions that were passed on to the sending towns. Bedford spoke with their feet. So in the Seacoast region, where we have a strong cooperative school district that was built specifically to provide all of our students in our 6 towns with a high level academic experience and be able to offer all of the programming that we believe they need to be successful. And I'm talking about advanced placement course, other dual enrollment courses, working with area colleges, opportunities for the music and arts, for athletics. We have to pool our resources. And that's what they decided to do back prior to 1996 when they worked to form a cooperative school district. There are a couple of points that I wanted to make. My idea of, or my thoughts about a commission are quite positive. And in that we were, I can't recall if it was Representative Myler or Luno or Ladd that suggested a couple of superintendents be a part of that commission. I would be more than willing to volunteer to be a part of that group. One of the things that I think we would need to address, however, are all governing structures, because I'm not certain that all of the members of our legislative body understand the difference between a cooperative school district, an area agreement, or other forms of governance. Because what happens with voters is when they're told their vote no longer counts, I think they get fairly upset. And should people wish to secede from a cooperative school district and recognize that they no longer have representation on the school board of a school to which they're sending their children, I'm not certain that they would be very happy with that. And I think people don't understand that. So a commission, I think, has a duty to educate its voters as well, so people can understand what it is that they would be ultimately voting for. The loss of control, the loss of the seat on the board, the development of a budget, the ability to vote for a budget, that weighs heavy on me for the folks that I represent, the families I represent, not just the families whose children attend our schools, but for the close to 80% of the families who live in our 6 towns who don't have children in our schools. Their tax dollars all fund our schools. And if they were then to be informed that their tax dollars were going somewhere that they didn't have a say in, that's a large body of people that I don't want to have to face. The last thing I would like to ask is that the genesis of these bills, particularly those to dissolve the cooperative, my question to the committee, one thing I'd ask that you remember is this a question of constitutionality? Are there things inherently wrong in the law regarding cooperative school districts? Or is this a question of wanting to provide other choices and opportunities for people in towns to do what they want to do with regard to education? In either case, there are going to be consequences and ramifications for both. What I'd like to leave with you is that in SAU 16, our cooperative school district operates very well. And as my colleagues have shared before, there are folks, including members of this committee, who might have some differences of opinion on how it should work. But we do have a democratic process that we follow every year to determine whether or not it's going the best that it can. And we always do that with a focus on what's best for our kids. I think.
Thank you very much.
I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions for the superintendents? Not seeing. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
So with that, we are, at an hour where I think we are ready to adjourn this meeting. However, we need to set a meeting, one more meeting here in which we will develop a recommendation to make to the whole. And hopefully we will have that, some of that feedback back from folks here as to if we go the route of a commission, then we'd have that. And I asked everybody on the committee here to be also thinking about, charges that might be given to a commission study. And I want to thank everybody who took the time to come away from your busy schedules today for this. This is a topic which is pretty heady, and speak to the need for this. In school building aid, we have a condition called consolidation to ensure that we're not splitting up and having buildings. We try to consolidate students into one facility, and that will, in the application process, that will give you additional dollars. Efficiency of the dollar, efficiency of the educational practices as well. Putting people under one roof and from multiple locations. So we understand, and I think that the recommendation this group comes up with is going to be a good one and hopefully lead to some resolve on this issue that's plagued us, myself, for the last 14 years, and I know for many, many others, over 50 years. And so, thank you. Any further comments from the group here today? If not, it's time for lunch, isn't it? Next meeting, yeah, get your calendars out. Let's look. Let me go get my calendar. So in October,
How about the 12th?
Columbus Day is the 10th. I have 1, 2, 3 the previous week. We have 1680 on the 3rd. Teacher shortage on the 4th, the pipeline. And meals and all that on the 6th. So looking at the week of the 10th. And, pardon me? It all works for you? Right now, it works for me, and it's best to get this plugged in, so by tomorrow it may not work. So what's good for the committee? Any day is good for me on there, so. The Wednesday, the 12th?
9:30?
How about in the morning? Yes, that way. So, yeah, 9:30 be good. Yeah. So 9:30 on October 12th, this interim study committee will meet and we'll come up with some kind of resolution as far where we're going with the bill. 12th at 9:30. That's good with everybody? Thank you. That was easy. Thank you very much, and everybody have a good afternoon. 9:30 for bills.